Welcome to another session from the School of Social Sciences, from the Sociology faculty. Today, I'll be talking about Indian civilization and how it has been looked at. We've previously had another lecture on it, and this one is a part 2 of the same lecture. We'll continue where we stopped. Just to take a quick recap, we looked at how India was viewed by various scholars. It's a sort of a comprehensive view of Indian society and culture. And there we looked at some of the approaches that have been adopted by scholars. I won't go into too many details, but just to very quickly say that India has been seen mostly in terms of either some of the traits or essential qualities and so on and so forth. You can find all these details in our course material in BASOH 171. Today's lecture is also part of that course. The course is Indian Society, Images and Realities. So to get back to today's lecture, as I mentioned, it is a continuation of the previous one. And today we will talk about, again, how India has been viewed by scholars. One of the scholars that we rely on heavily, particularly in this lesson, is Bernard Cohen. Bernard Cohen has studied India from both an anthropological and a historical viewpoint, and he has a very comprehensive and a large scale and sense of understanding of Indian civilization. So he, gives various exposés on how India has been looked at. One of the things that we often notice when we want to try and understand Indian culture is that its geography plays a huge part in how the cultural formations have happened, or even the political systems have developed, and how politics, culture intermingle, and they in turn influence the power dynamics, the various social formations, whether including the caste and jati systems and so on and so forth. So let's begin this lecture with what Bernard Cohen has described in terms of the geographies. So the geography of India, according to Bernard Cohen, can be easily seen in terms of three important geographical areas or zones: the perennial or nuclear zones, the root zones, the zones of relative isolation. We'll have a quick overview of some of these zones. The perennial or nuclear zones, according to him, are basically the fertile river basins, plains and deltas. And if you look at the map of India, you will see that the biggest concentration of human population is around rivers and the plains. So that's why you'll find that the Ganga, Yamuna, Doab region, the Satluj, Yamuna, Doab region, deltaic regions in the south are all been fertile grounds for human civilization, and there have been huge settlements in these areas. And these areas also are where large-scale agricultural practices have been found, and especially settled agriculture. When we say settled agriculture, we mean, a very organized kind of farming, which is different from foraging or even hunting. So when you have settled agriculture, it also means you have surplus, because it's related to markets, and then when you have surplus, you have some people who are freed from agricultural activity, and then they end up being artisans or craft people. So, which also results in exchange of goods, which means that there's been a lot of trade, contacts and trade routes and so on and so forth, mostly navigated through river basin, through rivers and so on and so forth. So these are perennial nuclear zones. They are nuclear because they have been the center of much of the civilizational activity in the Indian subcontinent. The next zone that Kohn talks about is the, as I mentioned, the Satluj, Yamuna, Doab. Just to recap what I said, you can have a look at the slide. These are some of the areas that are found in North India, the Delta, the Plains, and the Doab regions. And then in South India, you have the Godavari River Delta, the Krishna Delta, and the Kaveri and the Pennar. You also, of course, have many empires and dynasties which are located in some of these places. The Cholas, Pandyas, all of them concentrated on these areas. Now, the second zone that Kohn talks about is the root zone. Now, simply said, the root zones are basically the zones which act as roots between dynasties, empires, political entities, and also they become the roots for invaders and migrations and so on and so forth. So a typical example that is given is the Malwa region, which is the southwestern Rajasthan, or what we present say Rajasthan, which actually becomes the passage between North India and western coast and the Deccan. And once you move into the Deccan, then it also becomes a passage for further south. And what is often found about the root zones, and because you don't have settled agriculture, and also these are contact zones, because there is a passage. Because of this, you'll find that these root zones tend to have not a very distinct culture, and they can be an amalgamation of many influences, not necessarily very long-standing. So this is a characteristic, and in the Indian context, in geographical context, they would be in the semi-arid regions, which also were the sort of natural boundaries between some of these geographical areas. Maybe not as high natural boundary as the Himalayas in the north, or the sea which separates many places from other places. So these are the areas which we will, as I progress with this lecture, you'll see how they influence some of the way culture has got formed. And as I mentioned, they have no persistent political tradition and so on. The zones of relative isolation. This is the third particular zone that Bernard Cohen talks about. Now, the zones of relative isolation are relatively inaccessible and geographically less conducive areas for human settlement. Ladakh, for instance, is not only icy cold but relatively cut off from many other places due to its high mountain ranges. And because of the weather conditions and the inability to grow many things, particularly Ladakh doesn't have enough rainfall, so it is dry desert. That is one more reason why it doesn't find too much of settlement. Of course, in the modern context, these zones do not exist exactly the way Conrad has described them. There is accessibility now because we've made roads. Recently, I think one big tunnel was being made from Manali side, and so on and so forth. So they're not as inaccessible as they used to be, relatively speaking. But when in comparison to the plains of north or central areas, or even the deltaic regions, you'd find that they're relatively more inaccessible. So there are many such regions. Very quickly, the Gilgit in Jammu and Kashmir, for instance, the border zones around Nepal, such as the ones adjacent to Bhutan, parts of Sikkim, then the areas where Brahmaputra river enters Assam, plains, because these are also dense forest areas. Not only are geographical features such as mountains come in the way, but dense forestry, rivers can also become a case why isolation happens. So there are many such tracts in northeast India where it's highly forested. These are tropical forest, so which becomes even more dense. So regions between India and Burma, for instance, very densely forested. Then you have some of the very stark desert regions where nothing grows. There are no water bodies, so they're also relatively isolated. Like I said earlier, not all of them are completely isolated, but in comparison to the plains and other regions, they are relatively isolated. So these are the three geographical zones. Now, they do influence how India's political systems were formed. If you look at Indian history, for instance, you realize that most of states which were formed, including your Harappan civilization, revolved around river basins and around the river. So Indus Valley is a reason why we call it Indus Valley, because it was near the Indus River. Now, when we look at the structure and culture of India, we find that both religion, economy, and other areas of human society played a significant part in shaping our social and cultural life. Myths, religion, and also social formations combined together, and we continue to be informed by many of these ancient histories through our colonial history to now post-colonial social systems and social formations and dynamics of power and so on and so forth. The mythic and religious are intertwined with the politics and myths such as of the sacred kinship, and these are often justified or invoked to present political hierarchies and relationships. Many of the dynasties, for instance, just to give you an example, if you look at some of the Rajput dynasties, you will realize that they all have a sort of a lineage system or clans. You must have heard of, even in the Mahabharata, we often hear of the various vanshas. Vanshas are also literally can be translated as families. So you have Surya Vansh and the Chandra Vansh, and then you also have Agni Vansh. So, for instance, the Rajputs always trace their lineage to some of these Vanshs. And for instance, several of the Rajput clans, the feudatories which came out of, let's say, the Gujar Parihara Gujar Empire or dynastic political entity disintegrated, and the offshoots or the feudatories that came out from that particular political entity all claimed a certain lineage, which is called the fire, Agnivanshis. And the mythical origins of this is that a mythical entity was born out of a sacrificial fire in Mount Abu, and out of which they all claim their ancestry. So as you can see, myth and the legitimization that comes with that myth, which is supported by the Brahmanical order or whichever the hierarchical orders which put them in a certain political and social position, continues to have its hold on the kind of power dynamics we find even now in present democracies. For instance, some of these dynastic rules have continued in central India, in western India, and you will continue to hear these names such as the Chauhans and Solankis and so on and so forth. So you can see how history, mythology, regions, geography, and they all combined together to kind of give this complex social structure to Indian society. Now, yeah, as I mentioned, present-day social political order also draws significantly from the past, and I just mentioned loosely some names that resonate with the past empires, dynastic rules, and political powers. Now, but we have all these influences and these long history and geography that is so varied and regionally specific, and yet we seem to find that India seems to continue to kind of capture our imagination as a sort of a entity in itself, and that is why oftentimes India is also referred to as a subcontinent, because it has a very unique geographical position and also a sort of a long history which captures a lot of diversities but also captures a certain underlying features. So a lot of times the word unity in diversity is used, and yet, however, some people feel that India is not really a unified country, you know. So there are three different views. I'll quickly present them, but we don't have too much time. One view believes that India has much more of regional entity than it has unity. The fact that we have very specific geographical zones and the cultures developed around these geographical zones, whether it is forest regions or the plains or or the hinterlands or dry areas. Now, each of them produces their own geographies and ecologies, so your food habits develop out of that ecology, your clothing patterns develops out of that ecology. For instance, wearing loose, light material in the sultry southern plains or deltaic regions was common enough, whereas stitched pantaloons or what we now in the present day salwar kameezes used to be more observed in the western part of India, where there is a climatic difference where there are seasons and winters can be harsh and cold. So you do find that regions do affect, or the regional geographies do affect the cultures that emanates out of this kind of specific cultural, specific ecological areas. So some argue that regionalism is actually part of Indian society much more than its unity. And yet others strongly feel that India is actually far more united than we like to think. If it was so regional, then India could have been easily like Europe. And the fact that it did not develop into independent kingdoms, well, there were kingdoms, but also the fact that you gave a sort of a much more than a temporal authority to the kings. They were exalted, and the sovereignty was not always referred to in terms of geographical boundaries, also made these kingdoms very porous. As a result, you had sub-feudatories, several varieties of political entities that used to, would not let formations that are like Europe happen. So in some ways, they do believe that we do have a lot more unity. Embry, for instance, believes that the Brahmanical ideology and external invasions or intrusions have been significant in the emerging of nation states and countering the growth of regionalism in India. And as I mentioned already, that's what makes us very different from European continent, where each one of these individual nations have distinct cultures, and whether it is in terms of cultures or language and so on and so forth. One could easily argue that even in India we have these sub-nationalities, as some would say, but Ebre believes that these sub-nationalities never really developed into independent kingdoms or nations. So as a result, he argues that we do have a unity. There is a sort of a ideological framework which is Brahmanical, and then there is also these political situations which makes India a unified culture. Then there is another viewpoint which argues that we are actually unity in diversity. Now, this is a stance that is most preferred term that is often used. As a child, I remember that was the first thing I remember reading in, I don't remember which school text of ours, but it's a continuing theme that underlines many of the ways we look at Indian culture. So with this, I can say that just to kind of sum it up in about a minute, that the geography, the long political histories, the mythologies, and the cultural, ecological formations all contribute to the unique civilization that is India. With this, we would have covered one unit or a lesson in one of our courses for our BASOH program, which is Bachelor's in Sociology, which is an honors program. BSOG 171 is also a generic elective, so all our students who are opted for this course should hopefully benefit from this lecture. Thank you so much.